"Get out of my seat." The cabin fell dead silent. She didn't argue, just placed a single piece of paper on the folding tray. 5 minutes later, the captain changed, his tone doors closed, and the flight froze in place. Don't blink, their smallest mistake just triggered the airline's most expensive clause. Where are you watching from? Type your city, airport in the comments, and subscribe to Black Stories Box so you don't miss this butter-smooth power move. I never intended to document corporate justice at ground level that Thursday morning. The pre-boarding area at LaGuardia was already a pressure cooker. Delayed flights, understaffed gates, and that special brand of travel anxiety that's become America's unofficial national mood since the post-pandemic surge. With inflation driving ticket prices up nearly 23% year over year, and airlines still struggling with staffing shortages, the collective tension in Terminal B was thick enough to cut with the plastic knives they barely trust us with anymore. I settled into seat 4B, already capturing footage for my business travel channel, when I witnessed the confrontation in row 3. It started when Victoria Bennett approached seat 3 Ampere, the one she'd been assigned during check-in 22 minutes earlier. Immaculately dressed in a tailored navy pantsuit, Birkin bag casually at her side, she moved with the quiet confidence that money can't buy but certainty creates. Several passengers glanced up, then returned to their phones, missing entirely the significance of who had just joined, Flight 1372 to Chicago. As she prepared to take her seat, Richard Ellison, already sprawled across 3 Ampere with his jacket, claiming half of 3B, thrust his boarding pass toward her face without bothering to stand. "Excuse me, I believe you're in my seat," Victoria said, her voice measured as she showed her boarding pass. The contrast between her composure and his immediate hostility was striking. Richard barely glanced at her ticket before dismissing her with a wave. "You're in the wrong section, honey. Is the economy dream cabin too far back for you?" His eyes scanned her outfit with deliberate slowness, the implication clear in his tone. At 0 feet, altitude bias had already taken flight. The passenger in 3C visibly cringed but said nothing, retreating behind noise-canceling headphones, the universal sign of not my problem in modern air travel. A flight attendant, Bradley Wilson, according to his name tag, approached with the practiced neutrality of someone who'd seen this drama before. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, looking between them with the vague disinterest of someone whose primary concern was an on-time departure rather than justice. His body language already leaned slightly toward Richard, an unconscious alignment with the passenger who looked more like the typical first-class demographic in his mind. "This gentleman is in my assigned seat," Victoria explained calmly, displaying her boarding pass again. She didn't raise her voice or make demands, just stated facts with the precision of someone accustomed to boardroom presentations. "Ma'am, perhaps you could step back to the gate so we can sort this out," suggested Amanda Chen, the gate agent who had appeared behind Bradley. Classic move, remove the quieter person from sight rather than address the real issue. We're on a tight schedule with our departure slot. The artificial time pressure was already being weaponized against the person raising a legitimate concern. Bradley took Victoria's boarding pass, holding it up to the light with exaggerated scrutiny. This doesn't look quite right," he said, voice pitching higher on the last word. The microaggression wasn't subtle. Several passengers nearby exchanged glances, the cabin's atmosphere shifting as people chose sides without having all the facts, a microcosm of how public opinion forms in real time. That's when Emma Park, a 20-something in row 2, started her Instagram live. "You guys, you won't believe what's happening on my flight right now," she whispered to her followers, her camera framing the confrontation perfectly. Number seat 3 Ampere began trending almost immediately, with comments flooding in faster than she could read them. "Another day, another example of," one viewer commented, the rest left implied but understood by her audience. Captain Dennis Reynolds poked his head out from the cockpit, checking his watch with exaggerated concern. "We have about 10 minutes before we lose our slot," he announced to the cabin crew, not bothering to lower his voice. The artificial time pressure tactic, classic airline strategy to rush resolution at the expense of fairness. With the FAA's new scheduling constraints and the airport's notorious congestion, the threat of delays carried extra weight. "Security has been notified," announced Melissa Jackson, the flight supervisor, loud enough for everyone to hear. "We ask that all passengers cooperate so we can depart on schedule." Her tone carried the familiar subtext of, "Don't make this harder than it needs to be," that so often accompanies situations where procedural convenience trumps individual rights. Throughout this escalation, Victoria remained seated calmly, opening her leather organizer to extract a sealed document. She placed it on the tray table without explanation, her composure unbroken despite the mounting pressure. The contrast between her stillness and the growing agitation around her was like watching someone stand in the eye of a hurricane, centered while chaos swirled. The booking system displayed a duplicate 3-ampere alert on Bradley's tablet, but Victoria silently showed a timestamp screenshot in her app, proof she had checked in 22 minutes before Richard. "Digital evidence doesn't lie," she remarked quietly, though she was met with Bradley's dismissive system. Glitches happen all the time as he continued to prioritize moving the conflict out of sight rather than resolving it fairly. That's when Eleanor Harris, an elderly woman in row 5, stood up shakily. "I don't know this lady," she said, her voice thin but determined, "but I saw him yelling first. That matters to me." The cabin's energy shifted subtly, the first crack in the automatic alliance with the loudest voice. Eleanor's simple testimony carried the moral weight of someone who had witnessed enough history to recognize patterns when they repeated. Victoria placed the sealed paper with an official embossed seal on the tray. "Captain Reynolds should probably review this before calling security," she suggested quietly. Her calm was more unsettling than any shouting could have been. It was the confidence of someone holding 4 aces who didn't need to reveal her hand prematurely. Captain Reynolds reluctantly approached, breaking his usual protocol of staying in the cockpit during boarding. He unfolded the document, his expression shifting from annoyance to shock as he read Clause 47, Operational Conduct on Leased Aircraft. His eyes darted between the paper and Victoria, reassessing her from problem passenger to significant stakeholder in real time. Victoria gestured subtly toward the tail number decal visible in the doorframe. N457M. "You might want to verify that with operations," she suggested, her voice barely above a whisper but carrying the unmistakable authority of someone who knows exactly what strings to pull. Emma zoomed in with her phone camera and her chat exploded. "OMG, this plane belongs to MAH Leasing. Is that Monroe Aviation Holdings? This is getting juicy." The digital audience was connecting dots faster than the crew, their collective knowledge base filling in gaps that the airline staff hadn't yet processed. Amanda was still arguing process. "We assist customers of all colors equally," she insisted, the unconscious bias in her phrasing hanging awkwardly in the air. Her attempt at neutrality had inadvertently revealed the very framework she was operating within, one where equality needed explicit assertion, suggesting its absence was the underlying issue. Melissa stepped forward. "I'm taking responsibility for this situation," she announced with newfound seriousness, sensing the shift in power dynamics. Her posture had changed completely, the transformation that happens when someone realizes they're not dealing with a routine passenger complaint, but potentially a contractual breach with significant financial implications. Captain Reynolds immediately called Operations Control, his voice lower, more urgent, as he verified the lease agreement details. "I need confirmation on tail number N457M. Yes, the lease terms. Specifically, Clause 47. The cabin fell silent as everyone strained to hear his side of the conversation, the collective realization spreading that this was no ordinary seating dispute. The announcement chime rang through the cabin, confirmation received. Aircraft N457M is leased from Monroe Aviation Holdings to Skyroute Airlines. Clause 47 requires immediate pause of procedures if discrimination complaints arise on MAH-owned assets pending verification. The official acknowledgement transformed speculation into fact. The aircraft they were sitting in belonged to Victoria's company, and the rules of engagement had just fundamentally changed. The document Victoria had placed on the tray wasn't just any paper. It was a notice of compliance that had been previously sent to Skyroute NED. Incident occurring on MAH-owned aircraft required the captain to pause departure procedures for documentation and recording. When the rulebook sits on a tray table, you don't want to be the one banging your fist. Emma's livestream was gaining traction by the second. Number grounded right just hit trending in the Northeast, she announced to her viewers, her follower count visibly ticking upward as the drama unfolded. The comments section filled with reactions, many tagging Skyroute's official accounts with questions about their handling of the situation. "Their PR team is probably having a meltdown right now," one commenter noted, the prediction proving accurate as events continued to unfold. Eleanor shared from her seat, "My son was once told he wasn't suited for a middle seat on a flight. He served 3 tours in Afghanistan. Her personal story added emotional resonance that spread through the cabin like ripples in still water. Several passengers nodded in recognition, either from similar experiences or sudden awareness of patterns they'd previously overlooked. Richard texted furiously delayed because of some drama queen. His ally in 4C nodded in agreement, but they were increasingly isolated islands in a sea of shifting sentiment. The passenger in 3C had removed his headphones, now fully engaged in the unfolding situation, rather than hiding from it. Amanda made a critical error speaking too loudly near Emma's camera. If she'd just stayed in coach, then the 2-second clip was already being shared across platforms, stripped of context but devastating in its implication. Social media's ability to amplify moments of unconscious bias was working at full capacity, the algorithm feeding on the controversy. Skyroute's internal PR team messaged Captain Reynolds, "Do not allow forcible removal of the passenger. Repeat, no physical escort." Too late. The narrative was already spiraling beyond their control, with aviation bloggers picking up the story and financial news sites beginning to monitor potential impacts on Skyroute's already volatile stock price. Victoria quietly sent 3 emails from her phone, one to legal, one to investor relations, and one to her FAA liaison. The content remained hidden, but her slight smile suggested strategic moves being set in motion behind the digital curtain. She wasn't just reacting to events, she was orchestrating a response across multiple domains simultaneously. Captain Reynolds found himself caught between the pressure of their departure slot and the event compliance hold mandated by Clause 47. His forehead glistened with sweat under the cabin lights as he weighed his options. The complex calculus of operational costs, customer satisfaction, regulatory compliance, and contract obligations played across his face like a silent movie of corporate anxiety. An aviation journalist direct messaged Emma requesting video rights. The story had officially escaped the confines of the cabin and was about to go national. The spotlight was warming up. When does the grounding happen, you ask? Coming up next is the number that made the airline break into a cold sweat. Captain Reynolds cleared his throat before making the announcement over the PA system. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are implementing a ground hold due to an incident compliance check. We appreciate your patience." The collective groan from passengers unaware of the underlying drama was audible, but those in the first few rows who had witnessed the confrontation remained silent, watching the consequences unfold with fascinated attention. "She's nobody," Richard shouted, his face flushed with anger and embarrassment as the realization of his miscalculation began to dawn. His attempt to reassert dominance only highlighted how completely the power dynamic had shifted. Victoria placed her business card on the tray. Victoria Bennett Monroe Aviation Holdings, managing partner. The simple declaration landed like a judge's gavel in the now silent cabin. Several passengers glanced at their phones, searching her name and finding confirmation of her credentials within seconds. The modern verification of authority happening in real time. Operations read the clause aloud in cases of suspected D.I. violations on leased assets. The captain must close doors, maintain position for documentation and verification. Missed slots would not be exempted from this requirement. The financial implications of this clause were significant. Delay costs, fuel burn during ground hold, potential crew duty limitations, and downstream impacts on the airline's schedule would add up quickly. Melissa attempted a compromise. "We could offer Miss Bennett another seat." The suggestion hung awkwardly in the air, revealing a fundamental misunderstanding of the situation. This wasn't about accommodation, it was about accountability. Victoria smiled. "I'm already in my correct seat." The statement was factual rather than triumphant. She wasn't celebrating a personal victory, but establishing a precedent that would benefit others long after this flight was forgotten. Skyroute's PR team begged Emma not to post more footage. "Too late," she replied, showing them the viewership numbers already climbing into the thousands. The internet doesn't have an undo button. The digital record was becoming permanent, making transparency the only viable strategy for damage control. Victoria's FAA liaison responded to her email. They acknowledged her report and requested preservation of all body cam and security camera footage. The regulatory dimension added another layer of consequence to what had begun as a simple seating dispute, elevating it from customer service failure to potential compliance investigation. The cabin erupted in murmurs when operations confirmed this aircraft was part of MAH's periodic audit program. Today's random check was completely legitimate. The ground hold was a contractually valid trigger. You're not just watching an airplane, you're watching an airplane learning how to be human. Where have you witnessed something similar? Drop a quick comment below. Subscribe to Black Stories Box so you don't miss our next episode. Victoria calmly outlined her 3-point proposal: A. Measurable bias training with KPIs. B. A reporting app with direct access to the board of directors. And C. Disciplinary action for unauthorized live streaming of passengers. Her approach wasn't punitive, but constructive, addressing the root causes rather than merely treating symptoms. Melissa referenced the airline's existing policy about disruptive passengers, to which Victoria responded, "That very language feeds bias. When disagreement becomes disruption based on who's speaking, we have a systemic problem." Her critique went beyond the immediate incident to address the linguistic frameworks that enable discriminatory practices to persist unchallenged. Richard finally apologized, clearly motivated by fear of ending up on a no-fly list. Victoria shook her head. "Not because you're afraid, but because you understand. That's the difference that matters." Her distinction highlighted the difference between compliance and comprehension, between following rules and internalizing principles. Amanda reluctantly acknowledged her habit of believing the loudest voice first, a professional blind spot that had guided her initial response. "I've never thought about it that way before," she admitted, the first genuine step toward examining her own decision-making processes. Eleanor stood again. "I'll testify to what I saw if needed." The cabin had definitively shifted allegiance, the collective moral compass recalibrating in real time as the facts emerged. Her willingness to stand as witness represented the community's role in accountability systems. SkyRoute's PR team offered a $200 voucher as compensation, like trying to patch a whale with a Band-Aid. The inadequacy of the offer revealed how completely they had misunderstood the nature of the situation, still treating it as a customer service issue rather than a systemic failure requiring structural reform. The FAA liaison confirmed the case had been assigned a priority code in their system. The regulatory dimension would ensure documentation and follow-up beyond the immediate resolution, creating institutional memory that would outlast the news cycle. What surprised everyone wasn't that Victoria demanded money. She didn't. Instead, she demanded a binding contractual timeline for reforms. If deadlines were missed, the lease agreement would automatically be subject to review. Her approach leveraged financial incentives for institutional change, aligning profit motives with ethical improvements in a way that corporate America understood at its core. As tensions eased slightly, Victoria revealed something personal. Her mother had been a flight attendant for 7 years. Victoria herself funded a scholarship program for airline employees' children. "I understand the pressures cabin crew face every day," she explained. "This isn't about punishing individuals. It's about fixing systems that put good people in impossible situations." The American audience, which holds family values in high regard, softened visibly at this revelation. Several crew members nodded in recognition, the humanizing moment, creating space for collaborative rather than adversarial resolution. 2 more twists coming, one about shareholders, one about personnel. The investor relations call came through on speaker. SkyRoute shares are down 1.7% in pre-market trading due to the hashtag activity. The financial impact made abstract ethical concerns concrete in the language of quarterly reports and shareholder value, translating moral imperatives into business necessities. Victoria produced a draft lease addendum adding key performance indicators to the existing lease covenant. These metrics are measurable, achievable, and directly tied to passenger experience scores you're already collecting, she explained, demonstrating that ethical improvements need not conflict with operational efficiency. SkyRoute's board requested 48 hours to consider the terms. Victoria countered, "You have 24 hours to issue a commitment statement and 60 days for implementation." Her timeline was firm but reasonable, urgent enough to prevent institutional inertia but realistic enough to be achievable. "And if we comply fully," Captain Reynolds asked, already calculating cost-benefit analyses in his head. "MAH will open an additional lease line in Q4, Victoria replied. The carrot after the stick, creating positive incentives for compliance beyond merely avoiding penalties. Several passengers with business backgrounds nodded in appreciation of the negotiation strategy. Bradley's own unauthorized live stream surfaced, a clear privacy violation that resulted in his immediate suspension. "I was just documenting for my protection," he protested, not realizing his defense. Highlighted the very double standard at issue, one rule for staff, another for passengers. Amanda requested retraining opportunities. Victoria nodded. Restorative, yes, but with accountability. The balance she struck acknowledged both the need for consequences and the value of education. Punishment without learning would be as ineffective as learning without consequences. Emma was invited to consult on transparency for the reporting app's development, turning a witness into a collaborator. Her perspective as a digital native would ensure the tool actually worked for younger travelers rather than just satisfying corporate compliance checkboxes. The biggest revelation came when Victoria disclosed that MAH was negotiating the purchase of 12 additional airframes for SkyRoute, raising and lowering their future with the same finger. The condition: complete the reforms on schedule. The business implications were enormous. Fleet expansion represented jobs, routes, and market share in an industry still recovering from pandemic contractions. This boardroom on a plane scenario transformed theoretical ESG commitments into contracts with teeth. Next up in our finale, Who Flies, Who Stays Grounded, and Who Gets Banned, Captain Reynolds issued a public apology over the PA system and committed to 3 months of DI mentorship. "As your captain, I take responsibility for ensuring everyone on this aircraft is treated with dignity and respect," he announced, setting a tone of accountability from the top that would ripple throughout the organization. Melissa signed the incident report and sealed Emma's footage as a case study with her consenter. "This will be incorporated into our training materials," she acknowledged, ensuring the incident would have educational value beyond its immediate resolution. Richard received a 1-year SkyRoute flying restriction with the possibility of review after 12 months, contingent upon completion of a voluntary anti-bias program and a public apology letter. The consequence was significant but not permanent, creating a path to redemption that balanced accountability with opportunity for growth. Amanda was reassigned to customer care and enrolled in mandatory speak-up against bias training. Her new role would put her previous experience to use while developing the exact skills she had been lacking in this confrontation, a thoughtful reassignment rather than a punitive demotion. Bradley remained suspended pending further investigation of his unauthorized live streaming. His actions would be evaluated according to the same standards he had applied to passengers, creating consistency in policy enforcement regardless of position. SkyRoute announced the launch of their Sky Dignity app within 2 weeks, enabling anonymous reporting directly to both the board of directors and MAH. The digital tool would create transparency and accountability that bypassed traditional hierarchies, allowing issues to be addressed before they escalated to incidents. The aircraft finally received clearance for departure. We weren't just taking off from the runway, we were taking off from bad habits. In a final twist that no one saw, coming Victoria appointed Eleanor Harris to SkyRoute's new passenger advisory panel, giving everyday voices a seat at the table where decisions are made. The structural inclusion of passenger perspectives would ensure policies reflected lived experience rather than merely corporate convenience. As Victoria settled into her rightful seat, 3 Ampere, she sent one final message that Emma shared with her viewers. "When you witness injustice, don't shout. Document it, send it to the right place, and force the system to change. If you've witnessed something similar, share a sentence or two below without naming specific airlines or real people." Subscribe to Black Stories Box for a weekly dose of justice served with intelligence. You don't need to shout, just place the right paper on the right tray. I never expected to document the transformation of corporate culture at ground level that Thursday morning. The boarding area was already tense, with travelers irritated by the usual airport chaos, understaffed security lines, overpriced food, and the special anxiety cocktail that's become America's unofficial state of mind since flights resumed after the pandemic. Add in news headlines about airline mergers, labor shortages, and rerouted flight paths due to Middle East tensions flickering on every terminal television, and you had a perfect storm of collective irritability. I was settled in 4B, capturing B-roll for my business travel channel when Victoria Bennett approached row 3. Her confidence wasn't flashy. It was the quiet assurance of someone who knew exactly where she belonged. When Richard Ellison refused to vacate her assigned seat, I instinctively hit record, sensing the brewing conflict had storytelling potential. I never imagined I was documenting a masterclass in systemic accountability. "Let me see that ticket again," Bradley demanded, squinting at Victoria's boarding pass with exaggerated suspicion. These seat mix-ups happen all the time with certain groups who aren't familiar with first-class procedures. The microaggression hung in the air like stale cabin oxygen. Captain Reynolds emerged from the cockpit, his authoritative presence momentarily quelling the tension. "We have an FAA slot in 11 minutes, he announced to the crew. "Whatever this is, resolve it now." The artificial urgency was a classic pressure tactic. Schedule over fairness, departure, times over dignity. What fascinated me most wasn't Richard's entitlement or Bradley's bias, but Victoria's response. She didn't raise her voice, didn't cause a scene. She simply reached into her leather portfolio and extracted a sealed document that transformed the power dynamics of the entire aircraft. "This is a notice of compliance regarding Monroe Aviation Holdings' leased assets," she explained calmly, pointing to the tail number visible through the window. "As you can see, this aircraft falls under Clause 47 of our agreement with SkyRoute." The cabin grew silent as the implications rippled outward. Emma's livestream comments exploded. "Wait, she owns the plane. This is next-level boss energy." The script had flipped so dramatically you could hear the collective mental whiplash. Amanda's attempts to move Victoria to the gate had backfired spectacularly. "We can't lose our slot over a seat preference," she insisted, still not grasping the seismic shift occurring. "This isn't about preference," Victoria replied. "It's about compliance with a legally binding agreement that your company signed." When corporate power structures collide at 0 feet altitude, the resulting turbulence can be more educational than uncomfortable. Eleanor's intervention added the voice of lived experience. "I've been flying since segregated terminals were still a thing," she noted quietly. "Some things change, but patterns remain unless we name them." Her moral authority created space for others to recognize what they were witnessing. As Captain Reynolds verified the lease agreement, his demeanor transformed from irritation to professional concern. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced over the PA, "we are implementing a ground hold in accordance with our operational procedures. We apologize for the delay." Richard's face cycled through confusion, anger, and finally alarm, as he realized the woman he'd attempted to dismiss had the contractual authority to ground an entire aircraft. "You can't be serious," he sputtered, looking around for allies but finding fewer than he expected. Victoria outlined her requirements with clinical precision, documented bias training with measurable outcomes, a reporting system with direct board access, and immediate consequences for staff who violate passenger privacy through unauthorized recording. Her approach wasn't punitive. It was systemic, addressing root causes rather than symptoms. Amanda's unfortunate comment near Emma's microphone, "If she'd just gone back to economy where she looks like she belongs," had already been clipped and shared thousands of times. SkyRoute's PR nightmare was expanding by the minute, with the stock ticker reflecting real-time damage to shareholder value. When investor relations confirmed the pre-market dip, Victoria produced a draft lease addendum that transformed theoretical ESG commitments into contractual obligations with teeth. "Your quarterly investor calls mention diversity initiatives," she noted. "This simply creates accountability for those promises." The beauty of the situation wasn't just Victoria's individual victory, it was the structural change her actions catalyzed. By the time Captain Reynolds announced they'd reached an agreement, SkyRoute had committed to implementing bias training across all customer-facing staff, developing a direct-to-board reporting app, and revising their incident response protocols. Richard's one-year flying restriction with SkyRoute wasn't about punishment. It was about creating consequences that educated rather than merely penalized. "Consider it an opportunity to recognize patterns you might have missed," Victoria suggested, as he gathered his belongings to relocate. As we finally prepared for takeoff, Victoria placed her hand briefly on Eleanor's shoulder. "Thank you for speaking up. It matters more than you know." That small moment of solidarity captured what made this confrontation different. It wasn't about personal vindication but collective improvement. The cabin applauded when Captain Reynolds announced the launch of SkyRoute's new Sky Dignity reporting system and Eleanor's appointment to their passenger advisory panel. "We weren't just witnesses to conflict resolution, we were participants in systemic transformation." Victoria settled into her rightful seat as the aircraft finally began taxiing. "Sometimes the most powerful response to injustice isn't shouting," she told Emma's still rolling camera. It's knowing exactly which paragraph to reference. The $200 voucher initially offered wouldn't have cured bias, it might have cured hunger, but not the disease of discrimination. What Victoria negotiated instead was something far more valuable: accountability, with deadlines, compliance with consequences, and dignity with teeth. As we accelerated down the runway, I realized this was one of those rare groundhold incidents where the audience stands up and applauds. They weren't just trying to argue with a passenger. They were unknowingly negotiating with their lease agreement. Have you witnessed injustice during your travels? Share your experience below without naming specific companies or individuals. Subscribe to Black Stories Box for weekly case studies in intelligent justice. No shouting required, just the right document on the right tray table.